Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to OSSE's Entry and Exit Codes training for LEAs. This webinar session is intended to support LEAs with their use of OSSE's Entry and Exit Code guidance for the 2016-17 school year. My name is Danielle Ireland, and I am a program analyst and trainer on OSSE's Training and Technical Assistance team in the Division of Data Assessment and Research. I will be joined by Laura Marisi, also in DAR, and I believe that Stephanie Davis may also be joining us as well. So we have a team here that will be supporting your questions throughout the presentation. I do want to start with just a few housekeeping matters. One, this session is being recorded so that it should be to the benefit of other users and posted online for use throughout the year. Also, because of the webinar format, we are going to try to save questions to the end of the presentation. You'll notice that this session was to go from 1:30 to 4. I will not be presenting for 2.5 hours. My presentation will be for about an hour, and then there'll be some time at the end to address any questions that you submit throughout the webinar. And also, if any LEAs need to stay on or have conversations with OSSE about particular questions around enrollment data, we have that time. And so at this point, I'm going to go right into our presentation on entry and exit codes for the 2016-17 school year. So here's the agenda for our time together today. We're going to start with an introduction. Hopefully you guys all agree that entry and exit codes matter. That's why you're here for training. You want to make sure that you understand what the expectations are and how we're using them. So we'll make sure we have shared understanding around why entry and exit codes matter, and also what LEA's responsibilities are concerning entry and exit data that are sent to OSSE. We're going to go over briefly the basics of entry and exit codes, the types of entry and exit codes that OSSE has as standard exit codes, and a few new items for this year in terms of entry and exit codes. Then we're going to dive a little deeper into the guidance around how entry and exit codes impact the student roster. We're going to touch on entry and exit codes in terms of enrollment audit, and also special education and how your entry and exit codes impact the SEDS roster, special education data system. We are also going to go over some special circumstances around enrollment, including non-public transfers, the adjusted cohort graduation rate, also known as ACGR, and we're going to touch on youth dropout. And then we're going to end with ways for LEAs to obtain technical assistance and support around entry and exits. And then we'll have a portion of discussion at the end. And again, because of the webinar format, we're going to use the questions feature here in GoToWebinar, and you can submit your questions throughout this presentation. And then at the end, I'll address them, and we can have some exchanging around any questions or clarifications that need to be made. So let's get right into it. Why entry and exit data matter? Well, entry and exit data have far-reaching implications for your student rosters and for the ways that OSSE represents your LEAs and your students here in our data systems and reports. OSSE will use your entry and exit data for a number of matters, but including determining students' enrollments and withdrawals, confirming that, to inform your LEA payments, to produce federal reporting, and to also calculate student mobility and graduation rates. We rely on accurate and timely entry and exit data for these examples here. And so, which data systems and processes rely on accurate and timely enrollment data? These are just some of the practical implications of the entry and exit codes that we receive from you. You should already know this, but we'll get into it, a little further into the presentation. Rosters and SEDS are impacted by your entry and exit data. We'll talk about non-public placements and enrollment audit. As I mentioned, LEA payments and ACGR, and even downstream systems such as the Transportation Online Tool for Education, or TOTE, are all impacted by accurate and timely enrollment data. And so what are LEA's responsibilities concerning entry and exit data and the codes that are sent to OSSE. Well, one, ensuring that the data you send to us are accurate and timely, and that they correspond to the actual enrollment and withdrawal movements that your students are making. We expect that you are recording at least one valid entry or exit code per student in your student information system to reflect that entry and withdrawal. We also expect that you guys are collecting and retaining documentation that supports the entry and exit codes that you're using, and that you're maintaining that documentation throughout the year. And we also expect that you are documenting the way that your entry and exit codes are mapped to the OSSE standard codes, right? So if you're using different codes in your system for entry and exits, that you've mapped those to OSSE's values so that we can do those translations and know how to interpret your data. We also, and I've mentioned this before, but providing documentation for exit codes for all students within 5 days of the student's exit, and that is per OSSE's LEA data management policy. And then finally, we hope that you are going to avoid backdating student entries and exits, and this really ties into the timely data entry portion. And we'll talk a little more about the implications of backdating student movements in your data system. Why to avoid backdating data? Well, one, when you backdate student entries and exits in your student information system, this can cause persistent data quality issues in OSSE's reports. Enrollment data discrepancies can impact other downstream systems and platforms, including the performance management framework and the reports that are available in CLIC for the charter board to view and use in their work with you. And so here we'll go through an example of how backdating your entry and exits can impact data quality in one of the reports that OSSE provides. Let's look at the following example. So we have student A, and student A withdraws from LEA B on February 1st, 2016. So this is a mid-year withdrawal. However, the enrollment record is not updated until March 1st, 2016, which is a month later. Okay. The issue here is that if LEA B submits that exit date of February 1 on March 1, that student will have been active in the data feed for that entire period between February 1 and March 1. The implication for that is that for that 1 month period, the LEA would not have captured attendance for the non-attending student. However, OSSE's reports will still expect attendance for an enrolled student. And for those of you that are working in CLIC and have been dealing with the attendance anomalies for this past school year, you know exactly what this means, that if we have an enrollment period for a student, there's an expectation that we would have attendance for that student. And so the sooner you let us know that a student has exited your LEA, the report can update and will no longer expect attendance. So that's just one example of how a backdating practice can impact data quality. And so now talk a little bit about how enrollment data moves from your LEA SIS to our systems and even downstream systems beyond SLED. Enrollment data are sent to SLED, SEDS, and TOTE, and even other systems such as CLIC and downstream systems from your LEA SIS. So the graphic that you have in front of you shows how the data flows from your SIS and then through the ATT server for most LEAs, and then down to SLED. That's the first stop on OSSE's in terms of you being able to view your data in one of OSSE's environments. And then from SLED, in the next business day, it'll move, provided there are no data errors preventing the feed, it will move to SEDS and then those other downstream systems such as TOTE and CLIC and so on. The important thing to note here is that we receive the data in SLED from your LEA SIS. And so there are times when we may receive requests for information to be corrected in SLED, a student that should be added to SLED or removed from SLED, or a demographic data change that needs to be made. And we just want to stress that these data elements are sent from your SIS, and they must be updated in your SIS and then fed to SLED. There may be times when there's an issue with the feed, it's correct in your SIS, and so we can have a conversation about an ATT issue. but certainly we would start at your SIS to ensure that those data elements are correct and that they're being sent from your system to us. And please feel free, as I'm talking through these items with you, to submit questions to the question box, and we'll address them, as I mentioned, at the end of the webinar. And we have Laura Marisi here with us, and so she'll be able to support your questions as well. So we'll go on to entry and exit codes, the basics. What are entry and exit codes, the types of entry and exit codes that OSSE has in our guidance, and what's new for this year. So entry and exit codes are 4-digit codes, and they signal enrollment and withdrawal actions of students. They let us know when a student comes in and when a student leaves. And there are 4 digits in terms of the OSSE standard codes. We expect that the LEAs have at least one of these codes in their SIS, which corresponds and maps to each of OSSE's valid entry and exit codes. And OSSE's entry and exit codes are found in OSSE's entry and exit guidance, which is currently posted on OSSE's website. And I'll give you details on how to access that document if you have not already. But that is where you can find OSSE's entry and exit codes. So we'll get into the types of entry codes that OSSE has. Continuation codes. These are codes that OSSE uses to determine students who are remaining enrolled in the same DC public or public charter school and are going to continue to receive education and funding without interruption. These codes are typically following the end of a school year, and so this is showing that the student is going to continue on in their same in the same school, and there's no interruption. Transfer codes are used for students who change a program or school or even move between LEAs, but remain enrolled in a DC public or public charter school and are going to continue to receive education or funding. And so these are mid-year movements, and again, you would use a transfer code for students who may change LEAs, but you would also use a transfer code if you have a student within your LEA that's changing schools, and so these codes let us know that that movement is occurring. Here are some other entry codes. An original entry code is used for students who are registered and enrolled in DC for the first time from either outside of the U.S. or for the first time in any U.S. school. So these are brand new students to the DC system, and they are for the first time from outside of the U.S. or for the first time in any U.S. school. The distinction is that regular entry codes are used for students who have previously received schooling in either DC or another state and are registered and enrolled in the district, either for the first time in the DC public school system. Okay? And each of these entry codes, these are categories of codes. When you review the guidance document, you'll notice that within each category or type of codes, there's a number of details for each circumstance or scenario. So there are a number of different entry codes that you may use and find appropriate for your student entries. So you want to make sure you read the details on each of these codes for these types of entry codes. So now we'll move on to exit codes. These are the types of exit codes that OSSE has. We have credential codes. Credential codes are when students complete a required program or course of study, including a diploma, certificate, or other recognized completion milestone. So this is involving a credential. This is contrasted by our end-of-year codes, which are used for students who are remaining enrolled in the same DC public or public charter school during the next school year, or who will transfer to another public school in the state because the student has completed the last grade offered by your school or your LEA. And so you can see how this end-of-year code looks a lot like the entry code for continuation. And so you'll notice that the entry codes are often very related to the exit codes. You want to make sure that you're using the appropriate entry and exit codes. At the end of the school year, right now is the season where you're closing out your 15-16 exits and also preparing for your pre-enrollment. So you want to pay close attention to ensure that you're using the right type of exit code for your student circumstances. Here are some other transfer codes. Here are some other exit codes. Just like we had a transfer code for an entry, we have a transfer code for exits. And these are for students who are still enrolled in DC public or public charter schools and are continuing to receive education or funding. These are students who, again, are changing programs, schools, or LEAs. Please note that if the transfer is occurring at the end of the school year, then you're going to want to use the end-of-year codes. Okay? Transfers are for mid-year movement. And then we have exited the state public school system, which are used for students who exit the state to be schooled in a different state, a foreign country, or if they exit the state public school system to be homeschooled or to attend a private school in state, or if they died or were permanently incapacitated. And so these are for students who are exiting the DC public school system altogether. That's when you want to use those codes. And again, each category or type of code has many different codes listed that you want to make sure you pay attention to ensure that you're using the right code. Here are among the last of the exit codes. We have discharge codes, which are used for students who withdraw from school but did not drop out, or were withdrawn from the school due to LEA-specific eligibility, disciplinary, or other policy reasons. And so if you've used discharge codes before, you know that these can refer to sometimes there's immunization issues or a truancy policy issue. If you're discharging a student, you would use the discharge codes for those scenarios. The disengagement codes are used for students who discontinue schooling before reaching the maximum age for compulsory attendance, or for students whose whereabouts are unknown. Okay, and disengagement codes are for students who have also exited to an institution that is not administered or tracked by the DC public school system, and so this can mean students who are exiting and transitioning to incarceration and other types of institutions that are not involved in the public school system. So under federal guidelines, the students for which you would use the disengagement codes, those are considered to be dropped out. Okay, and so we want to avoid the use of those codes, particularly that whereabouts unknown category, but this is when you would use the disengagement code for those students who discontinue schooling. And so what's new for this year? Not too much, okay? There are two new codes that OSSE is implementing for the 16-17 school year. We have 1880, which is a new entry code, and that is a code that will be used for students who are enrolled in your LEA, one of your schools, to receive special education services only, okay? This is not an entry for students who are enrolled in your actual full program. This is for students who may be enrolled in another program in another school, but perhaps your school is providing related services, or the student is seeing a specialist and you need to enter them into your system to capture them. If your school is only providing special education services for the student, then you would use the 1880 code for that circumstance. And then we have a new exit code, 1968, which is withdrawn due to exceeding the maximum eligibility age for IDEA services. Okay, and this is split out from 1962. We want to make the distinction about the max age for students who are receiving special education services. The max age for compulsory attendance is still 18 years old here in the district, but students do have until the semester in which they turn 22 to continue receiving services, and so you can make that distinction when you're withdrawing students who are aged out of SPED services by using 1968. Okay, and so like I mentioned, there are not too many new things for this school year, but we want you to make note of them because you need to use these for specificity in your exit or entry data, and they are available to you. Okay, I'm going to move on to entry and exit codes beyond the basics. So we'll talk a little more about how entry and exit codes impact the student roster and how they impact enrollment, and also how they impact the special education data system. Okay. And again, feel free to submit questions if there's anything that we need to revisit or clarify when we reach the end of this presentation. So, entry and exit codes, they are used to first determine your SLED roster, and it is real-time tracking of all students' enrollments and withdrawals throughout the school year. So the first stop when you send your entry and exit codes are the students are sent to SLED. Starting in the 2016-17 school year, LEAs will need to provide documentation for all student exits, and this is a part of the new LEA Membership Tracker initiative. The exceptions for that documentation requirement are if the student is transferring within the state public school system, or if the student has been discharged or has disengaged, and then we get into that whereabouts unknown situation. For students who are transferring within the state public school system, because the movement is captured in SLED, we can see when the next LEA enrolls that student. So documentation would not be required in that instance, because if the next LEA enrolls them properly, OSSE will be able to see that. But you want to make note of this because the LEA Membership Tracker is going to be implemented this school year, and it is a new initiative that we are using to ensure that there are documentations for all student exits. About the LEA Membership Tracker, I do want to note that it is tracking real-time student movement, and that your students will remain on the SLED roster if an exit code requires documentation. And you can look in the entry and exit guidance. Each exit code should have a column with descriptions about the documentation that are required for them, if documentation is required. And so you want to be very closely when you're using exit codes to ensure that you have maintained the proper documentation to support that exit. Other notes about the LEA Membership Tracker, this tracker is accessed via SLED, so it's not a separate application. It's going to be a space in SLED where you can access, and if you already have SLED credentials, you should be able to get into it once it is launched. And it is very, if you're familiar with the adjusted cohort graduation rate process and the documentation that is required in that process, it is very similar, but in terms of the LEA Membership Tracker, this is real-time tracking of student movement, and the other distinction from ACGR is that this applies to all students, not just high school students. And so the implications for that LEA Membership Tracker are going to be across all LEAs. And please note that there will be more guidance and support and training available to LEAs prior to the launch of this, but we want you to just, in the context of the entry and exit code conversation, to understand how exit codes will impact the need for documentation and who comes off your SLED roster when you send us an exit code. So now we'll move on to entry codes and the stages of enrollment, and this is really the first part in terms of how entry codes impact your student roster and what you're seeing in SLED. So one, the 6 stages of enrollment is a required process of every LEA, and it was required by law in 2014. Each stage represents a different milestone in the enrollment process. Stages 1, 2, and 3 really refer to processes that take place on your side at the LEA. It does not involve any data exchange with OSSE. This refers to when a student applies to your LEA, when you accept the student, and then also when they accept the seat that you've offered them. So that's stage 1, 2, and 3, and you guys are managing that without OSSE's involvement. By stage 4, 5, and 6, the student is registered and you're certifying enrollment to OSSE, and that's when you will begin to see students appear on the rosters that OSSE hosts. In terms of the 5 stages of enrollment, ADT can accommodate all 5 stages of enrollment, so you would just need to ensure that the dates that represent each stage in that process are captured. And if you do not have space to capture a distinction, for example, between stage 4 and stage 5, you would want to make sure you connect with your student information system vendor to ensure that this is captured and configured so that you can send those dates to OSSE. And then, if you need more support around ADT configuration and ensuring that your data are correctly mapped, please let us know, and we can reach out to you following this presentation. But we want to make sure that your system has the capacity to send us this information because it is required. And just in terms of a little distinction between stages 4, 5, and 6, stage 4, this is the registration stage, when you register the student upon receipt of all of the required enrollment documentation and their agreement to attend your LEA. At stage 4, you would put in entry code 1800. Okay? 1800 is the only code that should be used for stage 4, and we also call stage 4 pre-enrollment. So if you've heard of pre-enrollment, that's what we're talking about when we say stage 4 and the use of 1800. Stage 5 is the receipt of educational services, which are expected to begin on the first official school day. So that's really the button seat date, right? When are these students actually attending your LEA? When do they first start coming? That would be the stage 5 date. And at that point, you would use any of those entry codes besides 1800. So all those other entry circumstances that we discussed earlier, that is when you would put those in for stage 5. Stage 6 does not involve data entry or data exchange with OSSE. Stage 6 is really enacted at the completion of stage 4. And it represents that the LEA is now obligated to determine eligibility for special education services and to provide those services on an existing IEP upon the completion of stage 4. So when you pre-enroll students, right, you're going to see them in SLED, but you will also receive access to their special education documents in SEDS. And this has come up because sometimes these special education staff who are working in SEDS may not be working on the data entry side in SLED and understanding how the data go to SLED. And so we hope that you guys are coordinating and working together so that as students show up in SEDS, they understand that these students are pre-enrolled and that our LEA has accepted responsibility for these students upon registering them and pre-enrolling them. Okay. Stage 4 enrollment should be recorded when the student or the student's family has completed all of the enrollment paperwork for registration. Again, you want to make sure that everything is completed and that there's the commitment there, because your LEA is assuming responsibility for providing those services. And we'll talk about, the students being retained in SEDS because they will be there so that you can provide those services. And that stage 5 enrollment should only be recorded when the student is physically attending your LEA. And in most cases, this is going to be your first day of school, but you may have mid-year students that enroll. And if you enroll them at stage 5, you should only do that if the student is actually there. If the student never attends a class at your LEA or never shows up, do not enter a stage 5 enrollment date. Okay? You will have students that you pre-enroll who never show up, right? And you can exit students from a stage 4 enrollment if they do not attend after they complete the registration. They would be considered a no-show. And there are ways to process an administrative no-show. We have 2 exit codes that will begin the process to administratively exit a student from your SLED roster. Okay? The first exit code is 4321. This code should only be used for general education students that are pre-enrolled at your LEA. We also have exit code 1234, which should be used for students in special education services. Okay, and the exit code 1234 will operate in terms of removing that student administratively under specific circumstances, which we'll get into. And I want to note that this is when it talks about students, being exited. There are 2 different spaces where they must be exited. They must be removed from your SLED roster and also your SEDS roster. And so we'll get into the distinctions of when one of these codes will allow the student to come off of both rosters as opposed to remaining on one of those rosters until a certain action is taken. Exiting a student, particularly special education students, from stage 4 is really where some additional actions and due diligence really is required. LEAs can designate that a student is an administrative no-show using exit code 1234 If one, there is not a record of attendance at the LEA, so the student is truly a no-show, and also the LEA can demonstrate that it has made significant attempts to ascertain the whereabouts of the student who never attended. So this is important because remember at stage 4, when you enroll the student, you assume responsibility for their services. And until that student goes on to another LEA, and OSSE can confirm that, the last LEA of enrollment maintains that responsibility. So LEAs are responsible to continue providing or making them available special education services to all special education students with a stage 4 enrollment until prior written notice is issued. And also, as was previously mentioned, that it is demonstrated that the LEA has made those significant attempts to ascertain the whereabouts of the student and documenting those attempts in SEDS. Okay. And again, this is another one of those things that would be in conjunction with your special education team, your special education coordinator, to ensure that the proper documentation is in SEDS. In terms of how students who exit are removed from the SLED roster following a stage 5 enrollment, students will be exited from the SLED roster if they receive a credential, if they transfer to another LEA, which should be captured in SLED if they were transferred within the district, if the student transfers out of the state public education system, if the student is discharged from his or her LEA, or if the student disengages or drops out, and that has been captured. The LEA is responsible to enter an appropriate exit code and date for each of the types of student withdrawals that were mentioned before. All valid exit codes will remove the student from the SLED roster. Okay. However, LEAs are required to provide documentation if the exit code indicates that the student has transferred out of state. Please note that DCPS and PCSB will provide documentation of student credentials in cases that are applicable. All unverified exit codes will default to the exit code 1984, which signals student disengagement or dropout. And we'll talk a little bit more about which codes signal youth dropout. So we were talking about how students come off of your SLED roster. Now we'll talk about how students get removed from your SEDS roster, the Special Education Data System. Once documented, students may be exited from the Special Education Data System if they graduated with a regular, advanced, or IB diploma, if they were awarded a state diploma from OSSE, if they exited the state public school system, if they died or permanently incapacitated, or if they withdrew due to exceeding the maximum age for special education services eligibility under IDEA. And we talked about the new exit code that LEAs can use to signal that. Please note that documentation is required for several of these types of exits, including exiting the state, and if the student unfortunately dies or is incapacitated. A student will you will definitely need to provide the documentation for those circumstances. And so here's a summary of exit codes that will result in, I don't want to say automatic, but it will result in a removal from the SEDS roster, and it does not involve all of the documenting due diligence and the PWN process that I talked about earlier. These are pretty straightforward exits, although some of them do require documentation. And I encourage you to review OSSE's entry and exit guidance for the specific details around each of these codes to ensure that you're maintaining the appropriate documentation. Please note that for exit code 1960, which is one of the discharge codes for students who withdraw due to and they are under the age of compulsory attendance, so they're under age 5 and they're eligible to seek re-enrollment, the student will be removed from the SEDS roster unless that student was previously found eligible for services under Part C, the Early Childhood Special Education Program. And in that case, the student will remain on the SEDS roster. Okay. Okay? And in that case, if for some reason they are not there receiving services, you will need to follow a guidance process, which we'll go into about how you can remove students from the roster that are non-attending or non-responsive to your attempts to provide services. But 1960 is one that, depending on their circumstance, they may or may not be removed from the roster promptly. And these are some of the other special circumstances involving special education students and entry and exit data. As I mentioned, the exit codes that are not on the list that I previously displayed, they will not result in automatically inactivating the student's status in SEDS. So those students are going to remain active in SEDS even though they have withdrawn from your LEA, even though they're not attending your school, even though they have been removed in SLED. They will persist in SEDS. And in these instances, the LEA is responsible to continue to provide special education services until prior written notice is issued. We also expect that the LEA has made reasonable efforts to contact the parents in accordance with the standards set forth in OSSE's initial evaluation and reevaluation policy, and that prior written notice is documented properly in SEDS. Once all of that has been completed, then the student may be administratively exited from SEDS. And again, I'll talk a little more later on in this presentation about how you can reach out to OSSE to have that administrative removal happen for you, because it is requested on an as-needed basis. It is not an automatic removal after you put in the prior written notice that the student will come off, right? We have to do that administratively on our side here at OSSE, and there is a request process through the OSSE support tool that I'll explain in further detail later on. So now we'll transition to entry and exit codes as they concern transfers to and from non-public schools, and also the adjusted cohort graduation rate. Non-public students are involving when a student maybe has been placed at a non-public school or a school that is not a part of the DC public education system. And when a student makes that transfer to a non-public school, the student must be withdrawn from your LEA using the appropriate exit code and then re-enrolled into your LEA using the appropriate entry code. And in those cases, that would be a transfer. Changing the school code that is assigned to the student to reflect that the student is enrolled in a non-public school is not sufficient for accurately tracking the student's enrollment and their movement to a new school. This is really, really, really important because just changing the school code can cause a number of data quality issues in downstream systems and reports. We've seen it this year involving the attendance anomalies, and just in terms of OSSE being able to appropriately interpret the entry and exit data that you're sending to us, it is really important that you actually complete a withdrawal for that student and a re-enrollment. And I'll talk about what that looks like specifically for both sectors. And it really is pretty much the same process. Dependent charters have worked with DCPS to complete this transfer, but generally it looks about the same. The student should be withdrawn using exit code 2040, which is a transfer code that describes when a student changes schools and maintains their enrollment within the same LEA. And then the student should be re-enrolled using entry code 1811, which is continuation. When it's transferred, excuse me. When that happens, DCPS remains, in this example, the responsible LEA and is obligated to retain an open slot at the school for the special education student in the event that the student completes services at the non-public and wants to continue his or her education at that sending school. Again, in the charter sector, it looks very similar. You're going to use exit code 2040, the transfer, and then the student should be re-enrolled. The public charter LEA, again, remains the responsible LEA, and the sending school should remain the responsible school, because at all times, while the child is placed at the non-public school, the LEA must maintain the capacity to serve that child at the responsible school. You should hold an open seat, in other words, for that child, unless and until the student's parent or guardian enrolls the student in another LEA. So in a nutshell, the LEA still owns that student, right? They're just receiving services, they're attending another school, and in the data system, it appears as that non-public school is under your LEA umbrella. So you would withdraw the student, you would re-enroll the student. I want to make a quick note here about data entry practices when you do your non-public transfers. Please ensure that you're using the accurate exit and entry date for these transfers, right? A student wouldn't exit your LEA or in your school and then also enter the new non-public school on the same day. So what you should do is exit the student as of whatever effective day is their last day at your LEA, and then when you re-enroll the student to show that they're at the non-public school, you should use the following day or whenever is the day that they're actually starting at that non-public school. It's really important that your exit and entry dates are accurate and represent the dates that those students actually exit and enter your LEA. And ideally, you are not sending us an identical exit and entry date for these cases. Other circumstances around, special circumstances around entry and exit include the adjusted graduation cohort. Any student that has a valid stage 5 entry code at any point when they're in grades 9, 10, 11, or 12, high school, or who has attended a degree-granting adult program belongs to a cohort. When students with valid exit codes that signal that they are transferred out of the state educational system, and these codes include 1940, 41, 42, 43, and 44, when we receive those codes for those students, they may be removed from the cohort. But after the LEA submits appropriate documentation to OSSE, and OSSE reviews and approves the documentation. Again, this is not an automatic process, and it does require administrative review. But the expectation is that you guys are submitting that documentation to us so that your ACGR roster is accurate, but we cannot make any changes until we receive the appropriate documentation that corresponds with the codes that we have received. Here is a listing of the codes that would result in removal from the adjusted cohort. And these are the 5 that I mentioned earlier. So these are when students exit the state and they are attending school in a different state. If they exit to a school outside of the United States, if they exit to be homeschooled or to attend a private school, or if they die or are permanently incapacitated. So these are all circumstances which would signal removal from the adjusted cohort. And they require the proper documentation for them to not be included. We have linked here the guidance document for the DC Adjusted Cohort Graduation Rate guidance. And this guidance provides more information about the required supporting documentation, and that using exit code 1984, the use of that code when documentation is not available. The guidance also goes over specific scenarios and guidance about unique student entry and exit cases and how you can handle transfer students. It also goes over those exit codes that are verified by DCPS and PCSB, which are those credential codes. And it also goes over the exit codes that you would use for non-graduate students. And so, this is just really going through how exit and entry codes impact your adjusted cohort in terms of how OSSE calculates that adjusted cohort graduation rate. And if there are students that you believe should not be included, you really must go through the process of submitting the documentation and ensuring that we have it in a timely fashion so that your adjusted cohort is accurate. Exit codes also impact OSSE's and DC's youth dropout calculation. Federal guidelines require that OSSE reports the number of youth in grades 7 through 12 who drop out of school in a particular school year. The ability of LEAs to provide accurate codes for all students is imperative to inform those obligations and ensure that youth are receiving the educational services that they are entitled to, really, and that they would need to be successful in life. And so we're going to present to you a table which summarizes those codes that will identify that the student is educationally disengaged or dropped out. So these are the codes, and there is actually this is a longer list than the previous list that we've shown you, but these are all the scenarios in which we would count that student as dropped out or disengaged. It's all of the discharge codes, and you'll see these represented in OSSE's entry and exit guidance. And then the disengagement codes. It's voluntarily discontinuing schooling, leaving the DC school system for vocational, GED, or other programming, and being not enrolled in status unknown, that 1984 category, is also a dropout, and we really like to avoid that because we want to know the status of all of our students here in our care in the district. And it goes on to even more disengagement codes. So in hardship, employment reasons, any reason that a student has left a degree granting program, but they're still eligible, is generally considered a youth dropout. So we really want to capture that accurately. Be aware as you're using these codes in terms of how they're captured. Finally, I'm just going to go over ways that OSSE provides technical assistance and support involving enrollment. And our primary mechanism for that is through the OSSE support tool. I'm hoping everybody that works in entry and exit data and is dealing with enrollment at the LEA level, that you have access to the OSSE support tool. If you do not have access to the OSSE support tool and you require it, please talk internally with your LEA leadership to ensure that no one else has it, and maybe perhaps someone else is submitting on your behalf. But if you require that access, please let us know. You can submit that in the question box so that we can follow up with you to ensure that you can submit OSSE support tool tickets. And then I'll also go over how to escalate an issue if it is not being resolved adequately in the OSSE support tool. So, again, in this document, there is a hyperlink to the OSSE support tool. The OSSE support tool is housed in QuickBase. It is a QuickBase application. And you can use this tool to submit what looks like a technical assistance ticket or help desk ticket. And when you submit the ticket, you'll receive a ticket number that you can use to reference if you need to follow up on an issue that you've submitted. And there are various team members here at OSSE that are working in the OSSE support tool to respond to your tickets based on different content areas, including enrollment. And if a student is not appearing in SLED or SEDS as expected, or is appearing in SLED or SEDS after you have withdrawn the student, you can submit a ticket to the OSSE support tool to receive guidance and support around how to resolve that issue. But please be sure to review all the relevant guidance documents and ensure that any due diligence has been completed and documented in the appropriate systems before you reach out to OSSE to ask that we take administrative action on an enrollment issue. So any of the previous scenarios that we've discussed earlier in this presentation where documentation needs to be provided, we would want to see that that has happened before we step in to take that action. And here's a screenshot of what the OSSE support tool looks like when you go in to submit a ticket. This is the panel for the request support section. When you're submitting an issue around enrollment data, you want to use the issue type enrollment/enrollment audit. And when you select that issue type, you're going to be presented with a number of subcategories from a drop-down list. And so you want to select the appropriate subcategory to let OSSE know exactly what your issue is. And you'll see here in the screenshot that we have a number of issues represented here, from the student is not in SEDS or the student is erroneously in SEDS. We also use this during the enrollment audit period to drill down and address very specific issues around enrollment audit data, including LEP status, demographic data, and even USI issues. So this is a pretty popular tool. A lot of tickets do come in, and so I suggest that you submit your tickets as soon as the issues pop up, and be mindful of very high volume seasons, like right now as we're going into the pre-enrollments for the 16-17 school year. So you do want to be mindful of that. For the issues concerning the special education data system or SEDS roster, and you have students who are persisting on your SEDS roster even after the exit code has been submitted, if your due diligence has been completed, if your calls have been made, if your PWN has been completed and it's accurate and it's been submitted in SEDS, at that point you want to request the administrative action in the OSSE support tool, and there's a special subcategory just for that scenario. It is called administrative exit from SEDS/PWN. And when you send that ticket type to us, it lets OSSE know that you know the deal, you know the guidance, you've done what you needed to do, and what you're telling us is, OSSE, just go ahead into SEDS and double check my stuff so that I can move forward in the process. The previous screen where you have some of these other enrollment issue types is when if we want to troubleshoot something with you, we're not really sure if this is an ATT issue, if this is a SLED issue, if this is a SIS issue. You may want to go those routes, but if you know what you're doing, you're trying to clean up SEDS, you want to go straight to the admin exit from SEDS subcategory and use that to fast track your SEDS tickets. Okay. I also want to note here, because I know that the audience is pretty diverse, and so we have some data managers that are joining us, we have some folks that work on the special education side joining us. This will need to be a collaborative process. There are times when we may receive a ticket from someone on the special education side to say, hey, why is this student still in SEDS? I have no idea why the student is still in SEDS. And then we may need to go into the feed to explain what exit code was used, why it requires additional documentation, and kind of going through that guidance. And it's really helpful if there's collaboration at the LEA so that the special education staff member can work with the data manager to have that information up front to know what date was the student exited, what exit code was used when the student exited, and so having that context allows us to provide better technical assistance to you and to really resolve your issue much more quickly when there's that collaboration at the LEA level. And then the reverse sometimes happens, where the data manager may submit the ticket and is ready to clean up rosters, and we have to let them know that there's additional action required on the special education side, and that typically the data manager isn't going into SEDS and submitting PWNs or prior written notice. And if you don't know what prior written notice is a special section in the special education data system where an LEA is documenting a change that is happening in a student's file or record, or an action that the LEA is taking concerning a student that is receiving special education services. And so those cases are very, very closely documented, and anytime there's a change or proposed action that is happening concerning one of those students, prior written notice is issued, and it's a special form that must be submitted in SEDS. And so when that form comes through, we can then take action, but we hope that there's collaboration at the LEA around that process. If there is an urgent issue concerning students' enrollment records, and when we say urgent issues, this is not a roster cleanup scenario, this is a inappropriate access. I'm viewing a roster of students that do not go here. There is a data feed issue that is impacting my entire LEA. And when those scenarios come up, we want you to reach out to us directly so that we can take very quick action and to resolve it. And we have an inbox for our training and support team, and it's ossie.dartraining@dc.gov. And when those emails come to us, we're able to take very quick action to address urgent needs. And so if there's something in the OSSE support tool that's unclear, it's a miscommunication, it really requires a conversation outside of the tool, you can escalate this way. So that concludes the presentation of OSSE's entry and exit codes, how they impact your rosters, scenarios for particular student populations and particular data collections and calculations here at OSSE. We've gone over how to obtain technical assistance and support. And so at this time, hopefully you've been submitting questions throughout the presentation. I know it required some multitasking, but at this time we're going to transition to reviewing any questions you submitted. And we're just going to take a 5-minute pause. If you want to have some time to jot those things down, we can do that. So I'm going to take about a 5-minute pause, and then I'll come back online to review some of what we've received from you. Thank you. All right, thank you guys for your patience. This is Danielle again. I have Laura Marizzi here with me as well, and we are looking over your questions, and we are going to provide some feedback to you guys on some of the questions that you have.
All right, so the first question we have is, in which system are we capturing these codes? From this LEA from Walter Thornton, this might be a specific issue with your LEA, so we can follow up with you individually after the webinar, but just as a general response to everyone, all entry and exit codes should be entered in your SIS, and they'll be transferred directly to OSSE from your SIS. So if you're having an individual issue there, we can reach out to you and try to troubleshoot that with you. For the next question, the exit date for the student's withdrawal should be the last day of attendance or the day after. The exit date for withdrawal should be the last day of attendance. For the next question, can a disengaged student return to the LEA? Absolutely. You would just re-enroll them using a stage 5 entry code on the day that they return to your LEA. For the next question, if a mid-year student becomes a non-public enrollment, do we exit them and re-enroll them as 1880? No, you re-enroll them as 1811. And this is similar to another question that we had below that asked 1811 or 1880 for the transfer entry. So when a student is enrolled in a non-public, they're receiving educational services, so that should always be the question you're asking yourself. If they're receiving educational services, even if it's at a non-public, you're the responsible LEA, you should use 1811. 1880 should only be used if they're just enrolled for special education or related services and they're not actually being educated in your LEA. Next question. Can you provide examples of what type of documentation would be acceptable? What do we do with the documentation uploaded to SLED? Yes, we can provide examples of acceptable documentation. I know that we have examples of documents that have been shared with high school LEAs through the ACGR process, and we can surely extend that information to elementary and middle schools. And the plan is that all documents for ACGR and for LEAP will be uploaded into the document upload section of SLED effective for school year 16-17, and I will work with my colleague Stephanie Davis to make sure that more information is shared with LEAs specifically about the LEAP process and the real-time student tracking.
Can a disengaged student return to the LEA? Certainly. As long as they're eligible for re-enrollment and there isn't some other reason that they would be disqualified due to residency or documentation issues. But generally, yes, they can be returned. They must be re-enrolled using a proper entry code.
So then we have a couple questions about no-shows. So I think the important thing to emphasize about no-shows is that the codes 1234 and 4321 should only be used for students who are given a stage 4 enrollment and then don't show up at the LEA. A no-show situation doesn't apply to a stage 5 enrollment, so it's really important to only use a stage 5 enrollment when the student has showed up for school. I know sometimes LEAs stage 5 all their students who have a stage 4 as of the first day of school, but it's really the responsibility of the LEA to ensure that those students actually showed. Unfortunately, if you do erroneously stage 5 a student who hasn't showed up to your school and you discover 2 weeks into the school year that they actually have never been there, you will have to exit them as a disengaged student, status unknown, or using an appropriate stage 5 exit code.
And just please note that if you do stage 5 students who are not physically attending your LEA, you're going to need to use a stage 5 exit code and go through that whole documentation process. And it can get really sticky if you have never seen this student before and you don't know where they are. So it's really important to, as Laura was saying, only stage 5 students that you are physically serving.
Next question, asking about age 5 by September 30th of the school year. Yes, in general, September 30th of the school year. I think there are a couple LEAs that use a December 30th cutoff, so that's according to the policy of your school, but at the state level, it's September 30th.
How can I access this PowerPoint after this seminar? Walter, I am working for everyone. I'm working to get the slide deck posted to OSSE's website, but for all of the attendees, I have your email addresses and I can shoot you this PowerPoint directly after the webinar.
In terms of a template for exit documentation, yes, OSSE has its own form that LEAs can use to document a withdrawal. A lot of LEAs have their own forms that they use, so we're happy to review the form that you have and make sure that it has all the required data elements. And again, I can follow up with everyone after the webinar to provide more detail on that process and the documentation requirements, because there are specific data elements that the documents are required to have on them. In terms of the membership tracker being in SLED, so this year the LEA membership tracker was piloted in QuickBase, and the goal is to have it go live in SLED for the 16-17 school years. Will continue to be a pilot for the 16-17 school year for all LEAs in SLED.
Students who have graduated but received a certificate of completion instead of a diploma. Students' tracks are defined in their IEPs. What exit code should we use? So earlier I was talking about the different types of exit codes, and under the credential type there is an exit code specifically for a certificate of completion. And so I believe it's 2021. So yes, if you look in the documentation for the entry and exit codes, there is a special credential code for receiving an IEP certificate, and it should be 2022, but you can look in the documentation for confirmation. It says your exit conversation and statement about the conversion to the 1984 exit codes, which is the disengagement whereabouts unknown, didn't account for end-of-year rollover. Will the promotion demotion codes remain valid for 16-17? Yes, they will. And this is a question from Adriana. Adriana, we need to follow up with you just to make sure that we have understood your question, and we'll get a response to you. And if it's something that's for the good of the group, we'll make sure that everybody receives the response on 1984 and end of year rollover or year-end transition. So we have to follow up with Stephanie Davis about that one. And we will not have to submit documentation for promotion codes, correct? No, you will not need to do that. And we should be able to see that in SLED. Here's a question about, will we still be required to submit documentation via SLED for duplicative enrollments? Yes, 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 Jennifer, thank you for raising that. And we will be providing more guidance around how LEAs can resolve duplicative enrollments. There are going to be times during this season where more than one LEA will submit a stage 4 or pre-enrollment, and sometimes stage 5s, which should not happen, but sometimes two LEAs may say that the student is with them, and you need to resolve those in SLED. Typically, the documentation for that process is a record of attendance, and there is also the duplicative enrollment resolution authorization form. It's called DRAS, but there's a form that you also need to sign and certify to confirm that that student is with you and is in your custody, and then also with some attendance documentation, you should be able to win that student in SLED. And so that is correct. Documentation persists in SLED for duplicative enrollments.
So I think we answered, but just to make sure, there are a couple more questions about certificates. So there's the 2022 code for certificate of attendance or completion for an IEP, but then there are also 2 additional codes, 2023 and 2025, for a certificate of completion for a technical or vocational course, and also there's one for a technical certification, which resulted in a nationally or state recognized vocational educational certification. So, and then there's also a code for an ESL certificate, and so when we met with LEAs and adult LEAs for specific feedback on the types of exit codes they'd want to see for certificates and certifications, those are the ones that were identified. So if there are additional situations that those codes don't meet, definitely you can reach out to me individually and we can talk about how to capture those specific scenarios. But I'm hoping that those codes cover all the specific types of certificates that students are receiving.
That's really helpful. There is a question about, is it sufficient to change the entry code from 1800 to a stage 5 code for the SLED feed? And no, you can't just change the, yes, you need to provide a stage 5 code, but you also need to provide a stage 5 date. And so that is where we were talking about the importance of your student information system being able to capture, if you're going to be sending stage 4 and stage 5, that you can capture 2 different dates for those scenarios. And so you would keep your pre-enrollment date with the 1800, and then you can let us know when the student is actually at stage 5, and then submit the corresponding stage 5 code. So a student will require a stage 5 code and a stage 5 date in order to make it into the SLED roster. What should be the exit date for no-shows? If as of the first day of school the student has not shown up, you can begin to process your no-shows. You may also be in communication with families about their intentions as of that first day of school. The point is that at that point, if you're converting students to stage 5, that you're ensuring that they are physically attending your LEA. If they are not, then you can process them as a administrative exit from stage 4. But you should not have no-shows before the first day of school. Will it be similar to last year's, Jennifer? I'm assuming you're asking about the duplicative enrollment process. And I believe that they're still confirming and working on the rollout for that. From what I know, there should be at least some elements that are similar to last year. I don't know if there are going to be additional steps, but again, certainly the documentation typically is an attendance record and the DRAS form. But please stay on the lookout for that information because it's going to be very important to you in the next couple weeks as the enrollments start to feed in. I also want to note, this is a good time to note that as of July 11th, we were operating in the 16-17 school year. You will begin to see changes in SLED. If you are sending any data to us, we are not processing it in SLED for 15-16, and we are working on the feeds for 16-17, and so expect to be having data mapping conversations, including your enrollment collections, and also expect to be submitting your pre-enrollments to OSSE and ensuring that your students are set up in your SIS because the ATT feed will be getting very soon, and you'll start to see new students in SLED shortly. But please be advised that any changes that you're making to enrollment data, I've gotten some questions recently in the OST about 15-16 enrollment issues. There are no changes from your SIS that are going to be reflected in SLED for 15-16 anymore. Do you need a stage 4 date? Yes. Every code must have a corresponding date. Okay? Every entry code needs an entry date. Every exit code needs an exit date. And so far, there are no other questions. So we're at 2:50. I think we can stay till 3 to just hang on for any last-minute questions. Adriana, we're going to follow up with you about your year-end questions, and I'll make sure I send the slide deck to everybody this afternoon. The exit date for the student, I just got one question. The exit date for the student's withdrawal should be the last day of attendance or the day after. Lady, it should be the last day of attendance. The exit date is the last day of attendance, and then what will happen is the next day it'll be reflected in the feed because we have nightly feeds. So if you make the change on their last day, it should, assuming you make the feed and it isn't submitted very late at night, it should show up the next day instead. Is this PowerPoint available to print for your personal reference? It will be as soon as you receive it. So I'm going to follow up at the conclusion of the webinar and send the slide deck out to the attendees, and then you can use it for your reference. I will also send a link to the guidance in that message as well so that you can review the document. Okay, thank you all. Have a great rest of the afternoon and look out for the follow-up email. Bye-bye.